Shall I test this one again? Is that better?
Yeah.
It's not much better. So we're just doing a sound check, folks. So
testing 1, 2, 3.
we should have done this last night. There's me and Bear. I forgot my guitar, or I would sing you a folk song.
1, 2, 3.
Something about saving the planet.
I can tell it's not yours. That one is not doing it. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Hello, test, check. Who's my ears? You're all very good looking, by the way. What do we think? Does it sound better? Does this sound better? Can you hear me in the back of the room? If anyone in the back of the room can hear me, there we go. I got a thumbs up from a gentleman in the back of the room. Much appreciated. Is that okay, Karen? Is the sound okay? Turn it up. So we need a little more volume. Our videographer says turn it up. Our videographer says turn it up. Listen. We got the soundboard right over there. It's very high tech here at Sac State. Is that better, videographer? What do you think? She wants a little more. That sounds pretty good. Maybe a little too loud now. I'm getting thumbs up from all over. Everyone says that's good. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Give us just one more minute and the real show will begin. Don't go anywhere.
Oh. It's been so long. Welcome, everybody, to the 2022 California Climate Policy Summit. Woo! We have all seen each other as squares on a screen, and it is so incredible to be in person. So thank you all for coming out of your homes and your offices and wherever you've been the past couple of years to be together today. It's fantastic. I do want to wish everybody, if you celebrate, a happy Easter Monday, a meaningful Ramadan, a happy Passover, and a great day with us together today. So I start off with a few announcements. I'm Ellie Cohen, CEO of the Climate Center. And the bathrooms are located on the left as you leave here. The Wi-Fi, you have directions on your table, but if you haven't signed up yet, the network name is SAC State Event, and the password is Herky1234 with a capital H, H-E-R-K-Y. Also, if you haven't downloaded it yet, we have an app, the Eventee app, which has the whole program for the day on it, and I encourage you to download it. There's also a QR code that you can get to right away from your phones. You'll find the agenda on there, details about the speakers, tools to network with your fellow participants. If you're having any trouble with that, you can go to the registration table and they'll help you. We also can take your feedback for any of the speakers in the day on there, and we really would love to get your feedback. So take your time to get that on your mobile devices and give us your feedback. We'd really appreciate it. We'll be having all of our food today in this room. This is ballroom 1-2, I believe. And our coffee break will be in here, as well as our reception at the end of the day. And feel free, if you feel more comfortable or need to eat outside, there are tables outside, and you can take your food outside as well. Also, if you want to tweet today, you can report on the summit and whatever you're hearing, and at hashtag CA Climate Summit. So let's get the word out about what we're doing here. Also want to invite our volunteer climate activists to visit the Climate Center Rapid Response booth at the back and meet some of your colleagues from other parts of the state and share what you're doing and learn about what they're doing. And most, I want to thank our sponsors. Oh, where did that slide go? Let's put it back up there. I want to thank our very generous sponsors and our key partners for making today possible. We're we're really learning how to do an event again. And so it's been exciting, and it really is truly wonderful to see everybody in person again. So here are our wonderful sponsors. Let's give everybody a hand. Thank you very much for being part of this. I wanted to start off today sharing a story that I think actually illustrates where we are in the climate movement here in California. I was very honored to have been able to attend several of the United Nations climate meetings, and in 2017 I went to COP23 in Bonn, Germany. And the third morning that I was there was a highlight I was looking forward to. You may recall that in 2017, a certain president had withdrawn us from the Paris Accord. Does anybody remember that? And what do we think about that? Yeah, yeah, it was pretty bad. But one of the things that happened there was that they had the U.S. Climate Action Center. So it was not officially under the State Department and under the Trump administration. It was separate outside. And there was an event that morning with Governor Jerry Brown and Mayor Bloomberg announcing all the commitments in the United States, regardless of what the president was saying at the time. It was really going to be exciting in my mind, but I was still somehow on California time and staying at an Airbnb about 20 minutes out of town. And all of a sudden I looked at the clock and it was starting in 40 minutes. And you have to wait in line through security, and I couldn't believe that I was going to miss it. I grabbed my things, I ran down the hill, and I looked across the street, and there was a man who had a UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, lanyard with the pass to get in. And I saw him getting into a car, and I yelled over to him, and I said, "Do you speak English?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Are you going to the UN climate meeting?" Looking at his lanyard, and he said, "Yes." "Could you give me a ride?" And he said, "Sure." So we get in the car, and he says, "I'm Mohammed from Kuwait." And I said, "Hi, I'm Ellie from California." And we started talking, and I met so many wonderful people at all of these meetings. Really, it's like thousands of our best friends we never met from across the world. So I always ask everyone I meet, what are your goals here at the climate meeting? So I asked him that, and he said, for there to be as little progress as possible. I actually thought he was kidding, so I burst out laughing, and then I saw him not respond to my laughter, and I thought, oops. And we ended up having a very interesting conversation. I had just come from here where we had had very severe fires in 2017, and we had an amazing conversation. His key point was, Kuwait doesn't have natural resources like the European Union, and they keep pressuring us to do other things. And I said, you have the sun. When we left each other, we shook hands, he smiled. Other people told me that their single goal in going to these meetings is to meet people who represent oil companies and oil countries, that petrostates like him. And I had this by chance meeting. It really was an incredible experience and one that I'll never forget. And it reminds me a lot of where we are in California. Because if we ask certain interests in our state today what their goals are around climate progress, they'll say the same thing, to see as little as possible. And by coming together like we are here today, we can overcome that by working together as a broad community and building our Climate Safe California campaign as a community. So thank you all again for being here. I have slides that probably many of you have seen before, but I want to just frame what we're going to talk about today. Fortunately, Professor Ramanathan had an injury on Friday. He's okay, but he's not able to travel from San Diego up to here. So he's not able to join us, and I'm going to highlight some of the science that he would have highlighted today. So let me just turn this around a little so I can see the slides. Our current climate goals set by the United Nations scientists are that basically we have to cut emissions in half by 2030, and we have to remove upwards of 1,000 gigatons or 1 trillion tons of warming pollutants that we already put into the atmosphere to get to a climate-safe future, what the United Nations is calling staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. Where are we at today? Anybody know? 1.1, 1.2, closer to 1.2 today. It's changing quickly. the problem is, there's several things here. The United Nations makes its decisions by consensus, and as bold as that goal is, and as hard as it is to get there, it's not enough based on everything that we're experiencing. And current pledges from all the countries of the world puts us to a 14% increase in emissions. And even here in California, we need to be doing a lot more. It is really, truly code red for humanity, as Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said, and we now have a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. The global leaders in the medical field earlier in the fall basically declared that no temperature rise is safe, that rapidly warming climate is the greatest threat to global public health. Here in California, we've experienced many extremes over the past several years, with wildfires just covering huge parts of the state. But maybe the biggest issue that we face is the issue of water. And we'll have a speaker around this a little bit later. But one study showed that we are in the worst multi-decade drought in recorded history. Recorded history meaning from lake cores and from tree rings. And we can see back 12 centuries how drought is a natural part of California's natural heritage, but that climate change has made this much more extreme and it's expected to continue at least until 2030. Professor Ramanathan has said that this is the issue for California. What do we do when the agricultural sector uses 80% of our water? What do we do when we don't have enough water for the kinds of crops that we're growing today? He expects that many of the crops we grow today will not be viable beyond 2030. And of course, there's increasing and worsening health impacts on our communities, and especially our working class and communities of color, our Black, brown, indigenous, Asian communities. Fossil fuel air pollution accounts for 1 in 5 deaths globally. Heat waves are the leading cause of death from different climate impacts, and over 7 million Californians are living with climate pollution every single day, living within 1 mile of wells and oil and gas wells. Delayed climate action costs lives and dollars, bankrupting our future. A new study just came out a couple months ago that eliminating fossil fuel air pollution in buildings and transportation in California would save $44 billion and 5,000 premature deaths each year. And we know it costs a lot less if we invest today. And we know the fires in 2018, for example, cost $150 billion, equivalent to a little more than half of our budget this year for the state. We have to start investing big now to save money and lives later. And 9 of 15 global tipping points have already been activated. But we have the ability to turn this around. One of the leading authors of that study made it clear we have underestimated the risks of unleashing irreversible change. We're seeing strong evidence already for declaring a state of planetary emergency. The next decade is our window, with consequences for all future generations. You all know this. You are climate leaders from across the state of California, but it's really important to be focused on what is it we need to do? What actions do we need to take? The climate reality is outpacing our policy. Some leaders are stepping up. But as we all know, California, with all of the great things that we're doing, has fallen behind. Assembly Speaker Rendon acknowledged this from Glasgow in the fall. I don't at all feel we in California are leading the world anymore. And there's all sorts of other countries and states that have targets that are way ahead of ours. Even our president and our federal government has more advanced targets. And targets truly unleash innovation and direct market forces in ways that can help us achieve the kinds of policies that we urgently need. The nation and the world are looking to us to lead, because as goes California, goes the world. And so we need more aggressive policies, and we have our Climate Safe California campaign with a goal of carbon negative, equity positive by 2030, and so that by 2025 we'll have enacted those policies that get us to inspiring global action. We have 3 key principles, and I'm almost out of time, and so I'll just check and be sure. Is Secretary Crowfoot here? Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm going to wrap up then. Our key principles in all the work that we do is it's based on the latest science. We want to ensure a just transition for fossil fuel workers, their families, and their communities. And we have to prioritize climate justice, which we see as racial justice and equal access to climate solutions. There's all sorts of policies that we're going to hear about from fantastic speakers in our plenary today and in our breakout sessions this afternoon. We have to prioritize full engagement with the communities that suffer the most, from air pollution, from water pollution, from power outages, and lack of access to climate solutions. And fortunately, there are positive tipping points. And us getting together today is one of those. Getting together in person as COVID has ravaged our country and the world. It's time for us to take up the fight together, to work across boundaries, even within the climate movement, so that we can make a difference. Things are happening, are taking off. We can just look and see what's happening with the youth movement, with the environmental justice movement. The LA City Council, anybody here from LA? Woo! All right. LA City Council unanimously voted in January to advance the phasing out of oil and gas extraction following what LA County had done earlier. Solar is now the cheapest form of electricity. It's cheaper to build renewables today than it is to run fossil fuel power plants. But our challenge is, what's happening here in Sacramento? Can anybody tell me, what is the biggest challenge we have in passing the bold science-based policies that we need? Yeah, the oil and gas stranglehold on our supermajority of Democrat legislature. So we need to figure out how to challenge that, and the way we will never have the same amount of money, but we're going to challenge it by supporting our leaders and by building a movement across sectors so that they can't ignore us and that we make the changes that are needed. Governments and policymakers are like sailboats. They go nowhere without wind. We all are the wind in their sails. So let's make it happen. Enjoy the day, everybody. We're so glad to have you here. Together, we're going to build power for a climate-safe future for everyone. Thank you so much. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Secretary of the California Department of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot. Secretary Crowfoot, you want to come up? I'm not going to go into his very impressive bio right now, but I do encourage you to read it and take a look at it. Secretary Crowfoot has been an amazing leader, and you can imagine someone who's very committed to climate action, to protecting our environment and protecting our natural resources, which act as a buffer to increasing climate impacts, that in his position, managing one of the largest agencies in the state, that he is doing so much to make a difference for all of us and really being a leader for us. In fact, he has been such a leader that when a previous president was here in the state, he educated that president on some of the basics of the science of climate change. So please join me in welcoming Wade Crowfoot.
Thanks so much. Well, I'm excited to be in person. Raise your hand if you're glad this is not on Zoom. Oh, man. Boy, this is one of the largest groups that I've had the chance to talk to in person over the last 2 years. And it has been a challenging 2 years, of course. We've navigated the pandemic ourselves with our families and our communities, in our workplaces, and we've experienced accelerating climate change. As I start off today's discussion, I won't speak too much about the problem statement or the climate crisis because you all are experts on that. But I will say that working on these issues over the last 2 decades and in state government for about half that time, we are alarmed with the rate of acceleration of climate change and specifically its impacts. You probably know that California is the first and I think only state to conduct its own climate scientific assessment in parallel with the federal climate assessment. We've done 4 of those and we're on our 5th. Our last 4th climate assessment was focused on working with our scientists across the state to understand how planetary changes are impacting California. And we were focused on trying to understand when the intensifying drought impacts, wildfire impacts, extreme heat impacts would really begin to be felt across our communities and our natural places. And believe it or not, 6 to 8 years ago, the best science, forward-leaning science in the state was predicting impacts in 2050 or even toward the end of the century that we're now experiencing today, or more accurately, over the last 2 years. Our wildfire crisis, our catastrophic wildfire crisis, is much larger and more dangerous than we thought it would be at this time. We are now experiencing the third year of a worsening drought, just 2 years after the worst drought in the state's modern history. In fact, in the last 7 years, 5 of those have been drought years. And extreme heat is threatening our communities, not only in our desert part of California or in even Southern California, but in Northern California as well. So we all agree in state government, certainly in the Newsom administration, that as proud of we can be as our collective progress on climate change in the past in California, we have to move further and we have to move faster, given the accelerating impacts of climate change. So what does that mean? I want to talk a little bit about our efforts to reduce carbon pollution and our efforts to adapt to climate change, what we call mitigation and adaptation, but also ultimately make the point that we no longer can bifurcate adaptation and mitigation. We have to do both together. And then I want to highlight one important piece of the puzzle that I think has been underemphasized in California and the world, and that is the role of nature or natural sequestration in our effort to climate neutrality. Thank you. Carbon neutrality. So the last decade, we've made real progress. 2007, Assembly Bill 32, really one of the first laws enacted that required a reduction in greenhouse gas pollution. You know that at that time, the goal was to reach back down to 1990 levels of pollution by 2020. Collectively across the state, we reached that 3 or 4 years early, and that is progress. But we know where we're headed, and that is carbon neutrality. That is to continue to prosper as the 5th largest economy in the world, to address this growing crisis of inequity across the state, and to transition beyond fossil fuels and carbon. So we're doing all of that with carbon neutrality, so-called net zero. I was in Glasgow in November, and it's pretty remarkable that there's no longer a debate about certainly climate change or reducing carbon pollution or even achieving net zero across the world. Essentially, in essence, all major nation states, economies were together in Glasgow, and everybody understands we need to get to net zero. The difference is that the timing, the deadlines that countries are putting on themselves to reach net zero. So in California, we're focused on achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, as early as 2035. I think part of the dialogue here today is, how quickly can we accelerate that goal? You probably know that the California Air Resources Board, which is really one of the best and strongest regulators in the world on air pollution and on greenhouse gas emissions, is conducting its scoping plan right now. The scoping plan is essentially the roadmap of how we're going to achieve carbon neutrality. And it's identifying how that could be done by 2045 and how that could be done by 2035. Now, keep in mind, this is seismic change that we have to achieve across our state. While we are proud that we have reduced carbon emissions, we need to significantly steepen the curve of reductions as quickly as humanly possible. It's why 2 years ago, the governor did something that was heavily criticized at the time, which is he directed through executive order that come 2035, internal combustion engine vehicles could not be sold in California. At the time, that sounded radical, but quickly thereafter, other states in our country, other nations, signed up or created their own 2035 target for the phase out of new internal combustion engines, and then car companies followed suit. So we know that bold target setting in California works. Now we have to focus on how we're going to achieve it. And so I know today you've got dialogue with experts up here on the different pieces of that puzzle. Part of that, part of those solutions is nature, are our lands. So I think in California, we've been remarkable about advancing technology to achieve our climate goals. So think energy efficiency. California way ahead of the curve, driving energy efficiency decades ago. Renewable energy, and there's a lot of important topics you'll discuss today around how do we drive renewable energy, both distributed generation and larger renewable energy. Zero emission vehicles, electrification, fuel cells, et cetera. But we haven't done a good enough job in California really understanding the role that lands play and our natural landscapes play in achieving carbon neutrality. You all know that part of our natural carbon cycle in the planet involves plants, trees, forests, landscapes, land, and that our lands can be a remarkable sink to remove and store carbon from the atmosphere, both in our forests and our vegetated landscapes, but in our soils as well. Or they can be a major source of our emissions, and we only have to look to the last couple of summers of intense toxic wildfire smoke that we've all been breathing in that has significantly worsened emissions. So we have a choice to make in California, and that is how will we manage our lands? And over the next couple of decades, will our lands be a continuing source of carbon emissions, or will they actually be a sink of carbon emissions? And there's incredible work happening underway, probably through a lot of organizations that you all represent, certainly through a lot of governmental programs around how do we improve our management of lands to keep that carbon on our lands, in our landscapes, and avoid it from going into the atmosphere. Our sister agency, the Department of Food and Agriculture, has a Healthy Soils program that we've been funding tens of millions of dollars in the last few years. And that's all about helping farmers, ranchers get more organic content into their soil. And there's multiple benefits of this. Not only does more organic soil trap and capture carbon and store that carbon, it also improves water retention, which is obviously important given the challenges that California is facing on drought. It also improves the value of that farmland, that ranch land for the future. There's so many good ideas like that Healthy Soils program. We've got equivalents in the urban environment to get more vegetation in communities that suffer from extreme heat. Our most vulnerable communities that are disproportionately impacted by these climate impacts. We're working to sustainably manage our landscapes, including our forests, to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. We know there's a natural wildfire cycle in California, and our tribal communities have been stewarding our land since time immemorial, managing that fire cycle. What we have to do, we know, is to manage our lands, including reapplying prescribed or cultural burning onto our landscapes to allow for small fires to stay small and avoid being catastrophic. So to guide this work on our natural and working lands, in coming days, we are finalizing and releasing our strategy. It's called the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy. It's the first of its kind that looks at lands as a sector, as a broad set of solutions to our climate challenges. And that's going to be really, really important. We're also launching in coming days our final strategy, which we call 30 by 30, to conserve 30% of California by 2030. This is complementary to this work to use our lands for climate solutions. Now, you may know while we face the climate crisis, we also face the crisis of mass extinction across our planet, where every day, every week, every month, we're losing species of plants and animals and other life forms off our planet forever. We know, the world, scientists across the world know we have to conserve more of our planet to avoid or to stem that mass extinction crisis. And that conservation of lands and waters across our planet also obviously helps with climate action. And so we are part in California of an international movement to protect 30% of the earth by 2030, so-called 30 by 30. And we're holding ourselves accountable for a pretty strong definition of what it means to be protected lands. And according to that definition, right now we've protected about 24% of California. Think national park, wilderness areas, working lands under environmental easement. And what this means is if we're going to meet 30 by 30, we need to conserve over 6 million acres of additional land in the next 8 years. And doing so will help not only on protecting our world-renowned biodiversity and stemming mass extinction in our own state, but it will also help with climate action. And we're really, really excited about that. Now, as we talk about, as Ellie sort of queued up, as we talk about driving to carbon neutrality and have a conversation on how quickly that can happen, we have to protect our people and nature from the impacts of climate change that are already here. When I started doing work on climate adaptation in the early 2000s, it felt like a wonky planning exercise for the future. You know, it seemed like a lot of the focus, all the elected officials were really focused on mitigation or reducing our pollution. And we're, of course, now at a point where we have to do both, and we have to do both together. It's not an either or, it's an and. A couple weeks ago, we launched our updated climate adaptation strategy for the state. The state legislature, about a decade ago, passed a law that requires our agency to spearhead an effort to essentially update our strategy around how are we helping Californians adapt to climate change. And I'm really excited, thanks to the work of our staff across agencies, we have a really forward-looking and I think very nimble adaptation strategy that's really meant to connect all the work we're doing in different sectors, whether that's water, for drought and flooding, for wildfire, for extreme heat. And we're connecting the dots around 6 critical priorities. In other words, ensuring that all of our adaptation actions are aligned with our mitigation actions and they're aligned or driven by these priorities. One of which is prioritize the most vulnerable communities in California. And I'm so thankful for your motto of carbon negative, equity positive. Because the fact is, if we take action to reach carbon neutrality and protect the state from the impacts of climate change, but we don't use it as a mechanism to build equity, then we've lost out. Because that's really the third major crisis I'd talk about besides climate change and biodiversity crisis, and that is the crisis of inequity in our state. We have more wealth creation in this state over the last 2 decades than most places in the world in modern history. Yet we have growing inequity and we have some of the highest rates of poverty in the country. So we have to advance our climate agenda. We have to accelerate our climate agenda. And frankly, we have to reshape our climate agenda to advance equity. And if we do that and we make progress, we will show the world what can be done. I'm energized because I'm alarmed, I'm concerned, but I'm also energized. Alarmed and concerned because we understand that climate change is here and now and it's getting worse, but energized because if we're going to figure this out across the planet, we're going to lead in California. And that's why I'm thankful for you guys being here today, for really identifying what needs to get done, for holding us accountable in state government on what we need to do and when we need to do it by. And Ellie, thanks for convening us at this important moment in time. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So thank you so much, Secretary Crowfoot. That's fantastic, and we really so appreciate your leadership. We have people going around with index cards to get questions from you. I have 2 already. First question is, what is the state's strategy for getting big ag on board with working land sequestration?
The great question. So, part of my job, part of our job in Sacramento is to bring everybody along on our climate agenda. And that includes agriculture. Agriculture is the lifeblood of a lot of communities across our state and in part the Central Valley. And if we talk about equity, we are not going to achieve our equity goals unless we maintain and build prosperity and equity in the Central Valley. That being said, big agriculture or sort of mainstream agriculture that some people talk about, has not embraced regenerative agriculture or carbon sequestration as much as some agricultural producers in the state. So I think our goal here is to mainstream these practices. And we're doing so by incentivizing farmers to actually make these changes. So a Healthy Soils program is a good example. where we're building models and funding models of farmers that are doing this work. What I've learned, been educated about agriculture, is farmers, have a lot at stake, right? So it's one thing for us to talk in Sacramento about agriculture. It's another thing for somebody to bet the farm, literally, on their practices. So farmers need to learn from farmers, and farmers need to learn from trusted advisors. And so we're working to build these practices, take them from, boutique practices to mainstream practices, and that's really our goal. The scoping plan will set a target on natural sequestration or sequestration on our natural and working lands, and that's really going to drive an implementation plan coming off this strategy where we're focused on really what are our numeric targets for working with the agriculture sector to sequester carbon.
Yeah, it's very exciting that we are moving towards setting real goals, measurable outcomes for this. We've been following the scoping plan at the Climate Center, and we do think that the goals that the California Air Resources Board is considering right now are probably way too conservative based on what we have found to be possible in our own research and others. So I'll just throw that out, not as a question, but a comment. How can we stop cities converting ag land into economic development of industrial growth?
Yeah, so we have a major challenge on transportation and greenhouse gas emissions in that we are shifting vehicles to zero emission, but we still have remarkable vehicle miles traveled, or the amount of miles that folks are traveling, and it's really compromising our GHG goals. But part of this is helping communities build around where there are jobs and infrastructure and shaping development away from sprawl. So we have some interesting programs at the state, including the SALC program, or the State Agricultural Lands Conservation Program, through the Strategic Growth Council, where we're actually funding open space easements around communities to encourage that growth inward. There's also a lot of good county planning efforts. We're trying to support county planning so they can identify where they want to conserve open space, where they want to conserve environmentally sensitive spaces, and where they want to grow. We know we need to build more housing in this state. We know we need to modernize our transportation system, but we have to do it in a smart way. And we think, folks want more housing in communities near jobs and transportation. We don't have, the authority for land use, or we don't have a lot of the authorities for land use in communities, in cities and counties. So it really is about partnerships, and it's about planning and investing in that open space preservation. So it's a work in progress, but there are some important tools that are in place to help.
Thank you. I get lots of great questions here, so we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have. As a youth activist, it is important for me to hold stakeholders accountable and take action and not just talk. So what are you doing in order to take action towards health equity?
Great question. So one thing we're doing is putting our money where our mouth is, and we are shifting investments or prioritizing investments to communities with challenging health outcomes. Historically, the state gives away a lot of funding to communities for resilience, or for building climate resilience, or building the health of communities. Unfortunately, historically, the communities that got most of that money were pretty affluent communities that already had the capacity to go after that funding. So in the state, what we've set are, in some cases, laws, in some cases, regulations, other cases, targets, where we're putting, in many cases, well over 50% of our investments in a limited number of communities that are the most challenged from health outcomes. So I think that's one place you can keep us accountable, which is, hey, Sacramento, you're talking the talk on health equity, but where are your investments going? And are you funding community-driven work? That's what we're trying to do, and we can be held accountable to that.
Great, thank you. Another great question. CARB's analysis of natural and working lands for the 22 scoping plan indicates that at best we can make natural working lands neutral, or a small carbon sink, but not a large sink. Do you agree? And do we need large amounts of other kinds of carbon dioxide removal, not just to focus on nature-based solutions?
Well, this is the first time that lands have been included in the scoping plan. So if you imagine it's our state's roadmap on climate action, our previous scoping plans didn't even have lands as part of the solution. So this is the first time we're including lands in that equation of literally how we're going to get to the carbon neutrality numerically. And I would say the modeling is a good 1.0 version. In other words, it's the first round of modeling that's been done to identify our land's going to be a source or a sink, and how much can they be a sink. I frankly think we should seek to go further than simply neutrality on our lands. I think if we effectively manage our lands, they can be carbon negative in terms of taking carbon out of the atmosphere in the next couple of decades. And I think that's what we should strive for.
Thank you. Let's give him a hand. When will the forest industry stop cutting so often?
All right. Well, that's a simple question. Couple few things. One is, whether it's oil or whether it's paper or wood, let's recognize that we consume a lot of resource as Americans, as Californians. And so I would say this, because we're driving to move beyond fossil fuels and reduce our extraction of fossil fuels as we're reducing our demand. We're also working to ensure that any forestry happens in a sustainable way. But we all have a role to play, and we all need to actually help transition. So it's one thing to come to Sacramento and say, you shall not allow. But on the fossil fuel side, if we don't get our demand down, we're going to continue to increase our exports from places like the Ecuadorian Amazon. And the car that you're driving that you want to change out for an electric vehicle, but you haven't yet, some of that gasoline is using oil that has been extracted from the Amazon. So yes, you have to hold us accountable, but you have to drive towards resource reduction. As it relates to forestry, we do have the strongest protections around our forested landscapes, and we need to do more. And we need to ensure that the management that's taking place is actually regenerative. What we don't want is extractive management that's treating our lands like an economic resource. We need to treat them like a natural resource. And frankly, we have to get more fire back on the landscape.
Yeah.
And we need to work with the commercial forestry industry to do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. California has not articulated a plan to stop drilling and processing fossil fuels. What's the plan?
Another simple question. Well, I'd say a couple things. For the first time in the state's history, we are committing to stopping extraction as phasing down and phasing out extraction as we phase out our demand. Every year since 1984, we've reduced oil extraction in California, and that's accelerating. Our focus right now is to protect communities nearby extraction, to ensure that, to the extent that we still need to extract, we're protecting communities that are impacted by extraction. It's a fair point that, while we've identified that end date for extraction, there is not a detailed plan year over year to get there. We're still exploring how to do that. But keep in mind, again, Californians will continue to consume oil until we rid our addiction on oil. And that will either come from California or other places. Right now, about a third comes from California. We're committed to reducing that extraction, but if we don't work together to reduce our demand, it simply means more imports from other places in the world. So hold us accountable for phasing out the extraction of fossil fuels, but I'd say work very, very hard in your own organizations, your own communities, to drive down the demand for fossil fuel, because that, to me, is going to be the real game changer.
We're glad that CARB is addressing the phase out of oil in the scoping plan. However, after drilling ends, wells need to be properly plugged. CalGEM is behind in closing idle wells. What can the state do to address that?
More. So our agency oversees the extraction of fossil fuels and the safe and permanent sealing and abandoning of defunct wells. And actually, historically, there's been remarkable amount of idle wells across the state. Those are wells that are not actively producing oil. Some of those wells are orphaned, meaning there's no responsible party to actually safely and permanently seal them. So we need to do a couple things. One is we need to hold oil companies responsible for a very strong law that the legislature put in place that requires idle well management. In other words, you either need to reuse the well or you need to permanently and safely seal it. So we're doing that, but we need to, frankly, up our oversight. And then we need to actually spend funding and accelerate the spending of funds on those orphaned wells, particularly those near communities. It's not enough to, as the question asker puts it, not enough to simply stop the extraction. We have to safely and permanently seal where extractions happened.
Yeah, thank you. I really want to, I have follow-up questions for everyone, but I want to be sure that everybody gets heard here. The 30 by 30 implementation will require long-term water supply for ensuring the benefits of this program. What is the resource agency doing to secure water supplies, particularly in disadvantaged communities?
So a lot. We have to, my colleague Joaquin Esquivel from the Water Board talks about the fact that we have 19th century laws and 20th century infrastructure for 21st century water problems. Meaning we have a very outdated system. We need to become, so much better about our water use, both on the urban side and the agriculture side. So we're investing billions of dollars in helping water agencies actually make that shift to more recycled water, more stormwater capture, certainly deeper conservation and efficiency, less reliance on faraway imports of water from rivers that frankly don't have enough water to give those communities and agriculture. So we're making that shift. But priority number one is to ensure the human right to water and the safe, affordable access to water. And you may know in California, despite being the 5th largest economy in the world, in recent years, we've had upwards of 1 million fellow Californians that live in communities that have insecure water. And right now, during the drought, we are providing emergency water to communities that have literally run out of water. Like they're turning on the taps and nothing comes out because they rely on shallow groundwater wells that have run dry. So the good news is that that's an area of demonstrable progress in recent years where the legislature and the governor came together and created the SAFER program that's putting $300 million a year toward reliable access in those communities. And we need to continue to invest in that priority.
Thank you. I read recently that there's still maybe 100,000 people who don't have access to clean water, drinking water.
Clean water and affordable water. That's another big challenge. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you. Consumers need impetus to leave fossil fuels behind. Oil and gas companies need impetus to change their business model to clean energy. What incentives will the state offer to these?
Well, there's some incentives underway. For example, the low carbon fuel standard, which is really complicated, but essentially it's subsidizing electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles by increasing the cost of carbon intensive fuels. So some of those market signals are already underway. Some probably need to be considered that are not been implemented. And I would say this is really the benefit of a discussion like this. The best ideas, I'll just be honest, in these jobs that I'm in, that I'm in right now, you don't have a lot of time to look up and out and be really creative. You're really focused on execution. And, the governor's got us really focused on accelerating everything we're doing, whether it's resilience or carbon pollution reduction. So we need the good ideas. If there are other incentives, if there are other signals that we need to put on consumers or on the industry, let us know what those are.
Okay, we have a whole list of them, and we'll give you a call later. One more question I think we have time for is, how are the additional lands that are to be protected determined?
That's a great question. So there's an amazing a technology platform that we've developed in partnership with an entity called Esri company, geospatial information company, called California Nature, or CA Nature, canature.org. And that is identifying where lands are already protected, where biodiversity is richest, where the threats are greatest, where sequestration is best, and where equitable access is needed. So we essentially have these tools that are helping us prioritize the lands to conserve based on climate, biodiversity, equitable access. So we're going to do some of that, but it is not a top-down solution. What I've learned in Sacramento is most of these solutions are not found here. They're found in local communities and the regions. And so on 30 by 30, we're really looking to those regional leaders, those conservation groups, those land trusts, et cetera, to identify where are the high-priority conservation opportunities, and then funding those. It's like that on drought. It's like that on wildfire. It can't be a command and control set of decisions around what are the priorities from where we sit in Sacramento. We have to empower regional leadership on climate. It has to be, because that's where the rubber meets the road, right? On cities and counties. And so on this, it's really going to be empowering regional leadership to drive on priorities. And then the idea is the state provides funding, provides legal authorities, programs, et cetera, to support that leadership.
Yeah, that's great. Before we wrap up, we have to stop. I just want to ask you, what's the hardest question you've ever been asked in this role?
Sure.
And any closing remarks for everybody?
One of the hardest questions is, are we going to succeed? Are we actually going to figure it out? And 5 years ago, I would have said absolutely. Now, I'm not so sure, if I'm being honest, just based on, all of the science and all the accelerating impacts. But I'll tell you this, if we have one life to live, I feel very, very lucky to be working on this issue. And, I think about my 7-year-old daughter and, kids and the future, and this is a consequential time.
Mm-hmm.
President Obama said, referring to his generation, which I'll associate myself with him. He's a little bit older, but he said, we're the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change, and we're the last generation that can do anything about it. Now, that's pretty stark. Now, we're going to be, other generations will persist, but I think the point is we have to act now.
Yeah.
The last point I'd make, because I know you're going to cut me off, is thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for holding us accountable. Recognize that you have leaders in Sacramento and the legislature and the governor that are really aligned on this. They're driving hard. Over the last 2 years, we're proposing $35 billion of funding to address climate change. So I would just ask, push us and recognize that we're rowing in the same direction. Encourage us to do more, be the wind in our sails, and help us understand how we can mobilize 40 million Californians. I think Californians get it, but we also need to bring everybody along. And with these targets, et cetera, we need to make progress towards those targets. It's one thing to set a target, it's another thing to make progress. So excited about ways we can do that.
Thank you very much. Let's give it up for Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot. Thank you, Wade, very much. Great. Just want to remind you that if you have questions for any of our speakers this morning, you'll see volunteers going around with index cards. Just raise your hand, and you can pick one up, and then when you have your question on there, raise your hand again. So is Dr. Cha here? Oh, okay, great. Oh, there you are. Thank you. Okay, fantastic. Well, come on up, please. It is really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mijin Cha, who's an assistant professor at Occidental College's Urban and Environmental Policy Department and a fellow at Cornell University's Worker Institute, where she works on the Labor Leading on Climate initiative. Again, you can read more about her. I want to give her as much time as possible. We are thrilled to have you with us today. Please come on up, Dr. Cha. Let's give her a hand. Thank you, Dr. Cha. Nice to meet you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Climate Center for having me here today. And I'm honored to be speaking along with all the other plenary speakers today. So just some basics. Why did we talk about climate justice? This is not helpful, sorry. I'm either too short or too tall for this current configuration. So why do we talk about justice when we talk about climate? Very simply, there is more to the climate crisis than just greenhouse gas emissions. The injustice of the fossil fuel system, thinking about who has borne the burden of fossil fuel pollution, who will benefit from a transition to low carbon energy. These are all considerations that we need to take into mind as we talk about the climate crisis. We really need to understand the social and economic consequences as we decarbonize for political and policy reasons. Science is clear, but we have to also be honest that people aren't moved by science alone, right? We can talk. Doing something wrong here. I'm not quite sure what. Maybe, is this better? I'll just hold it. Is that better? This is better. Great. Perfect. So, we need to think, the science is clear, but science alone does not move people. We can talk about degrees Celsius, we can talk about millions of tons of carbon dioxide, and nothing is really happening, because we need to really think about how the climate crisis will affect people and their futures. So I want to talk about 2 points in the time that we have today. One is that there is no doubt that we need to substantially reduce our carbon emissions, but how we reduce emissions is as important as the quantity that we reduce. And two, I want to disabuse us of the notion that we have to choose between speed and inclusivity. Rather than a distraction, the only way that we will meet our carbon emissions reductions goals is through equity, right? Equity is not a distraction, it is a path through which we achieve ambitious climate action. Oh, thank you. Wow. Yeah, I could just skip the whole first part then if we're already all on board. That's anyway, so how we reduce emissions is as important as how many emissions we reduce. So what do I mean by that? Let me use the example of cap and trade to illustrate this point. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story, but just to give a brief recap. At the time it was adopted, cap and trade was seen as the most ambitious program in the country. It was widely heralded by elected officials, leading environmental groups, and it was really seen, there was a lot of momentum behind the idea of cap and trade. However, this support was not uniform. Several environmental justice groups raised concerns, and when their concerns were largely ignored, they sued to stop the program from being adopted. And when they did so, they were widely criticized by mainstream environmental groups. If you Google cap and trade lawsuits, you will see just a slew of criticism against the environmental justice movement, both from supposed allies of the environmental organizations and from elected officials. The backlash was so severe that several organizations were actually blacklisted from funding because of their opposition to cap and trade. So what were their concerns? The environmental justice organizations were concerned that cap and trade would allow polluters to buy the right to pollute, and that environmental justice communities would continue to bear the burden of pollution of the fossil fuel economy. When you allow people to pay to pollute, you can think about where they pay to pollute, right? They're not going to pollute in areas in Los Angeles like Beverly Hills. They're going to pollute in areas like East Los Angeles, where there are majority people of color, low-income communities with little political power. So instead of allowing for this cap and trade system, they proposed that the state could either directly reduce emissions, where they directly mandate emissions reductions, or adopt a carbon tax program. That lawsuit failed, and the state moved ahead with a cap and trade program. So when we fast forward several years, we actually see that the environmental justice movement was correct. Right? Polluters can indeed pay to pollute, and with so many credits in the market, we are actually not anywhere near our emissions reductions targets that we need to be. Not only that, but several researchers, including Lara Cushing, Manuel Pastor, Rachel Morello-Frosch, and other environmental justice researchers have tracked the progress of the cap and trade program. And in fact, pollution has increased in disadvantaged communities as a result of this market-based system. The cap and trade program, to be sure, has raised important revenue for projects around the state. But we shouldn't let the financial aspects of the program color their reality. Relying on pollution for revenue to counter pollution is not efficient, right? The revenue from cap and trade pays for programs to reduce emissions, but that revenue comes from selling permits to pollute, right? This is not an efficient system. If the state had done instead what the environmental justice groups had argued for, we would be in a very different position. Right? Directly regulating emissions reduces emissions. If we want to reduce carbon emissions, we should mandate that carbon reductions are reduced. I don't know if it's because we've been on Zoom for the last 2 years, but this clapping during the talking is wonderful. Like, it's just like, I had totally forgotten. And even if we had adopted an economy-wide carbon tax, right, we likely would have seen much more emissions reductions while also raising revenue because it would be economy-wide. Now there are too many polluters that are allowed to continue carbon pollution, which is another reason why we're not seeing the emissions reductions that we need to see. So how we reduce emissions is as important as emissions reductions policy, which leads to my second point, which is that it's true that we don't have much time to act. The IPCC report is clear. We have less than 10 years to meaningfully reduce emissions. And this has led many climate advocates to argue that we need an emissions-only focus, right? You often hear something like, let's just get something on the books and we'll deal with the equity issues later. But that later never comes and has never come, right? What we don't have time for is this continuing mindset. We don't have time to do business as usual. We need to do something different because we need different outcomes. We need to stop thinking that we can just have something on the book that is neutral. There is no neutrality in society anymore, right? And if you choose to ignore racial and economic considerations, that is not a neutral perspective. You are choosing a side, and that side is one of inadequate and inefficient carbon emissions reductions. The only way The only way we will achieve the emissions reductions we need is by centering equity and justice in climate policy. In a paper titled, "Is Environmental Justice Good for White People?" the scholar Michael Ash and others found that when pollution is reduced in environmental justice communities, pollution's burdens are reduced for everyone, right? And that's because pollution, like emissions, are not static. They don't stay in one place. And when we reduce emissions in the most vulnerable communities where pollution is concentrated, we reduce emissions for everyone. So when we center the most vulnerable communities, we actually make the environment and society better for everyone. Moreover, the latest IPCC report made very clear that climate change is no longer a scientific issue. And what I mean by that is that we actually have the technology to reduce a substantial amount of reductions. The consensus is around between 70 to 80% of emissions can be reduced with existing technology. Climate change is now a political problem, right? Because we have a political problem, we need a political solution. So it's no longer that if we have the right technology or if we have the right process, we will see emissions reductions. No, we need a political solution because climate change is a political problem. So, thank you. I'm just going to stand up here all morning if you keep clapping. I'll just tell you. So when we think about the political problem, what I want to also emphasize is that this is not an individual issue, right? We could all reduce demand as much as we can in this room and nothing will meaningfully change. And I don't mean that to be disempowering. What I mean is that we need structural reforms. And if we need structural reforms, we need to build power. And you can build power either through money or through people. And we will never have as much money as opposition. We just never will. So we need people. And if we need people, we need to include as many people as possible. So to build power to push ambitious policies and counter the power of the fossil fuel industry, we need broad-based multi-issue coalitions. We need people to be able to see their own concerns and their own worries are reflected in the things that we are asking for. Right? Addressing people's bread and butter concerns builds better and stronger coalitions. And people, especially now, are considerate with how are they going to put food on their table. Right? The truth is that fossil fuel jobs pay better than renewable energy jobs. They have higher average wages. They have higher rates of unionization. And what we're asking is for people to give up that financial security for either a job that we know pays less or for an unknown economic future. Who would make that leap? Right? No one. And this is not to say, right, that we shouldn't be having meaningful action. But what it means is that things like wage standards, what kind of jobs we are creating, affordable housing, health disparities, these are all climate considerations. These are all climate policy issues. Instead of thinking about emissions, we need to think about much more broadly about how can we make people's lives better. And through making people's lives better, we actually will achieve ambitious emissions reductions. It's important to understand that also fossil fuels, while we hear a lot that they are better jobs, but it is not an inherently better employer, right? It is through the struggle of workers that fossil fuel jobs are better jobs, which means that there is no reason why renewable energy jobs can't also be good jobs, right? These are not natural conditions. These are the result of decisions that have been made. So we can make different decisions. So finally, I would just say that, we don't have time to continue to do what we have been doing. We need to start doing something different. And when we center equity, when we center the most vulnerable populations, when we center climate justice, we actually will build a better world for all and also ensure that we meet our emissions reductions targets. Thank you very much.
Let's give it up again for Dr. Cha. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you. Reminding everybody to raise your hand if you want a note card to write questions for our speakers, and then once you have the questions on the cards, raise your hand again, and our volunteers will come around and pick them up. And I'm very pleased now to introduce Veronica Carabay. As a co-founder and co-director of the Leadership Council, Veronica leads the team in advocating for sound policy to ensure equal access to opportunity for all Californians. She immigrated from Mexico at a young age and grew up in a small farm worker city in Fresno County. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful partner, Veronica Garibay.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, good morning. I hope this works for me, too. I think we're going to play a video first, and then I'll start my remarks.
Sí está difícil vivir aquí. puedes pensar que el clima está loco. El tiempo se vuelve loco. No tenemos muchas opciones para movernos ahorita.
Housing in where we live and the changing climate will make it worse. It's like you're in a metal box.
En las áreas como más principales, el sistema eléctrico es mejor, el agua es segura, tienen mejor recursos allá.
Our residents are working for agricultural companies that are multi-million-dollar companies, five-star hotels, country clubs, and yet they're taking home the absolute bare minimum wages. It's 100% a structural problem.
Hemos sido más ignorados por el hecho de que la mayoría no cuenta con documentos.
Thank you. This 26-minute video was produced by ProPublica and Time in partnership with community residents in the Eastern Coachella Valley. It's on YouTube and suggest everyone watch the full 26 minutes of the story of what not the story, but the real life consequences and impacts to communities that we talk about, but often don't see ourselves. How many of you have been to the Eastern Coachella Valley? How many of you have been to how many of you heard about Coachella Fest this weekend? How many of you heard that there were mobile home parks without access to power, without access to electricity in their homes while Coachella Fest is happening? So you heard a little bit about Pedro in the Eastern Coachella Eastern Coachella Valley. He lives in the community of Oasis Mobile Home Park. And, you know, we often talk about climate impacts in frontline communities, but we often don't really drill down to what that really means. That means Pedro lives in his home with his family of 4 in a mobile home. When it's over 115 degrees, it gets up to 122 degrees in the Coachella Valley. With no adequate air conditioning, often families are forced to go sleep in their car and run their car to run their AC in order to have some relief when the power is out. It's the story of Conchita in North Shore, who, because of extreme wind events in the region, 32 transmission poles went down because of no investment in electrical and renewable energy in that area that led to the entire community going without power for more than 5 days. It's stories of Natalia in Tombstone Territory in Fresno County, who sees and is 6 years old and asked her mom why there's a big black storage tank connected to her home in order for them to have water. And what that means to a child who's growing up in California, who's growing up in a region that is home to a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's the stories of, you know, I work in the San Joaquin Valley and the Eastern Coachella Valley, and often, you know, these are areas of non-attainment. We're not meeting our clean air goals. We're seeing wildfires. You know, the impacts of wildfires become more severe, more frequent, more extreme. And there are entire communities without fully weatherized homes, without energy efficiency appliance, without AC, without any recourse whatsoever to protect themselves and their families from poor air quality from wildfire smoke. There are workers, farm workers in particular, who are still working when the AQI is nearly 500 in the region. And there's imagine working or pruning in table grape and trying to work with an N95 mask on for 8 hours or more. And what that adds up to is lower life expectancy, health injustices, because as Dr. Cha noted, everything is connected. Climate justice is a racial justice issue. Climate justice is a housing justice issue. Climate justice is a health justice issue. And until we bring down and make sure that the people who are already more impacted, who are more vulnerable, who are more at risk, until we let them lead and follow their lead, we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes and perpetuating the same injustice that we have seen in California, throughout the country and the rest of the world. And we see what that means. We know what it means. We know who suffers when there's an extreme drought. The secretary just talked about the historic levels of drought this year. Wells are going dry. 1 million people without safe drinking water. Those are people who are relying on public water systems. That does not account for the hundreds and thousands of people relying on domestic wells or small communities with domestic wells, because we don't have all that data. That adds up to a lot more. And the issues are interconnected. We have to take a holistic approach to addressing and solving these issues, because we know that if we don't, who do you think keeps losing? In developing policy frameworks, in setting goals and targets, in thinking about the climate budget and where the climate budget is investing in it, they often do not center community voices. They don't center Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. They don't center equity. And it's not just equity, it's justice. We're not centering that for communities, and we tend to forget about Natalia, about Pedro, about Angelica, about Jenny, about David, about entire communities and children growing up right next to oil and gas wells, right across the street from their neighborhoods, from their schools, and from their playgrounds. And equity and justice considerations in the policy framework are always the first to go, always the first to be negotiated away, because the votes aren't there, because we can't convince our supermajority Democratic legislature to support equity and justice, because we take incremental wins at the expense of equity and justice, because we prioritize profit over people, because we don't make space for communities at the table. Often we hear and we talk about, well, the legislature is so fast-paced, and you have to respond, and you have to respond. Well, we have to respond in a way that centers communities and people, and make sure that we are being inclusive, transparent, and following their lead, and make sure that the legislature is responding to community priorities. So when we talk about being an ally to frontline communities, I'll just leave you with a couple of principles. And there are many, many other wonderful organizations working in the regions that I work in and working across the state that could be up here today and talk to you about what it means to be an ally, and what it means to really stand with frontline communities. So first, do no harm. Lead with no harm, and be willing to undo the very difficult but very necessary work of undoing past harm. And be humble about it. Stop investing in false solutions and in unproven technologies that don't work. In the Valley, we're seeing large dairies expand and expand and expand, causing local and air quality impacts in the name of climate change, in the name of responding to climate, because we're trying to, the state is investing in factory farm gas as a bridge to provide transportation fuels, while totally ignoring the fact that families can't eat in their own backyards because the odor and the flies are so strong that you cannot have an outdoor barbecue. Invest in community resilience and workforce development that leads with workers and communities first. Eliminate polluting fuels from how we define renewable energy and clean energy. There is no room for polluting fuels in a clean energy definition or renewable energy definition. Why do we keep doing that? Fight for direct emission reductions at the source. And finally, affordability. This is really important that we make sure that in our transition to a clean energy future, we're not placing the economic burden on lower income communities and communities who have already borne too much harm. We must do, as I said, the difficult but necessary work of undoing the legacy of harm in our communities. And in order to do that, we have to be willing to be led by communities most impacted in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that critically valuable perspective with us here. Thank you so much. My first question now is for Dr. Cha. If designed correctly, cap-and-trade policies will cap emissions, while taxes will almost always price pollution too low. Isn't it the structure of cap-and-trade laws that include credits that have resulted in inadequate solutions? Don't we also know that taxes have always fallen short? Should we not simply structure the laws to ensure the cap?
Yes. We should just cap emissions.
Yes, we should just cap emissions.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Okay, Veronica. Part of the is that Coachella Valley Water District collects funds. Oh, did I already just do that? No. Part of the water problem is that Coachella Valley Water District collects funds for property taxes, including poor communities that do not receive water from the district. Are you working for a solution?
We are there. We're working with several we're working to hold the Coachella Valley Water District accountable in a couple of ways too, but also working with a number of mobile home park communities and unincorporated areas within the boundaries of the district to consolidate them and connect them to a safe source of drinking water that is also affordable.
Thank you. Dr. Cha, what does fast and inclusive action look like? Great question. Yes, sorry. Good, let me see. I'm not. Oh, no. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Sorry, that's bad. No.
I like to steal phrases from my friend and mentor Manuel Pastor all the time, and one of them is Manuel always says, change happens at the speed of trust. So I know he's very smart. So when you build trust in a community, then of course you could move fast. But I guess my question would be, what does it mean by fast? There are already people like Veronica who are doing amazing work. And so I think what we often think of is like, how can we deal with this fast and inclusivity is because you want to start something new. And so you want to start something new and you think we don't have time to do that build up to build trust. Whereas I would say instead you should look to the people who are doing the work and support their work.
Thank you very much. Did you want to answer that also, Veronica?
No, I think she said it.
Okay, all right, thank you. Veronica, for both of you, can you talk about some successes on equitable climate action? What did it look like so that can be a model for what we should be doing going forward?
Sure. We tend to sometimes point at the local level where there have been some wins where you think about. So one of the comments I made and will likely be made throughout the conference by a couple of the speakers is that all these issues are interconnected. And so at the local level, in a couple of communities, we have worked to address sort of underlying and foundational land use issues. So getting down to zoning issues about what type of facilities, what type of investments are allowed in certain neighborhoods and certain communities. And so by engaging in, say, something like a zoning ordinance update, you're also starting to address the type of facilities and the type of emissions that they release in the neighborhoods, the type of investments that you want to see, how you build entire neighborhoods to be heat resilient, weather resilient, address the urban heat island effect if they don't have safe drinking water or aren't connected to water, how you make that happen. And so I think that a lot of that has happened at the local level and sort of shows how you can work in partnership at the speed of trust with community residents to both undo sort of racist and discriminatory legacies in communities that stem from redlining and other practices, to start building the kind of neighborhoods we all want to live in and the kind of neighborhoods that allow families to live in dignity.
Well, thank you very much.
I'll just add a few things that I think what makes things inclusive work is really the devil is in the details. So if we think about something like Justice 40, which is modeled after California's targeted investment program. Targeted investment is of course very good, and it helps to address some of these past harms. But there's a difference between benefit of communities and benefit in communities, right? So the benefit of a community means that the community will eventually benefit, and it can include things like overall emissions reductions, because that does is the benefit of communities. That's very different than benefit in community, which is a direct investment in community, right? So I think the issue with the inclusivity and making sure that it works well is really the devil is in the details. Where are you spending the money? Who is benefiting, right? Who is bearing the burden? Those are considerations that we have to think about.
And just to add on this benefit piece, which I think is really important, the state has this entire framework for investing in disadvantaged communities. There are minimums and floors set of how much money can go into communities. And I'll say that some of that is really problematic, to the point about devils in the details. It counts as a benefit if you have a zero emission bus that drives through a community but doesn't actually serve the community. So it is considered a benefit in the state climate program to a disadvantaged community to install a dairy digester right next to in the community, even though it further pollutes their water and creates localized emissions.
Thank you. On another topic, the term just transition can mean different things to different people. What does it mean to both of you, and what policies should California advance for a just transition for impacted workers and communities?
This is a great question, and a lot of my research is actually looking at just transition. And I think what you see now is a proliferation of neoliberalizing and kind of diluting the idea. So you see like just transition, just equitable transition, just equitable and fair. I think that the more words that people use, I think it becomes more just, but arguably if a transition is just, it is also equitable and fair. So I think for a just transit, there are two things that are really paramount, right? One is there has to be a transition. As was pointed out in the Q&A, we are not actually transitioning away from fossil fuels in California. We're just kind of creating these two dual systems where we continue extracting and we're also generating renewable energy. That is not a transition. So for a just transition, there has to be a transition away from fossil fuel extraction and use. And the second one is the justice component. And I think here, I would shy away from a prescriptive definition of this is what justice means, because it looks different in every community, as Veronica would also explain. So really understanding what community needs are, what worker needs are, and then ensuring that those needs are met is what then begins the road to just. I think it's a path, not a destination, right? Justice is a continuing process and a continuing pathway, but one thing that we can do is really focus it on the community level and make sure that community needs are being met.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and just add that for us, we've looked at it also more holistically and how it impacts all of the issues in the regions that we work. And in addition to being community and worker centered, that we're also being very clear about who's making decisions and who has decision-making authority on that pathway. And so I think that is the bigger piece. And often, we hear about just transition in the context of oil and gas, and in in our region, the agricultural industry also it cannot and it will not be sustainable at the scale that it exists today. And have started to see a couple of some indication that the department, if you know Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, you know that the state issued letters of incomplete for groundwater sustainability plans in the San Joaquin Valley region because the plans did not address either lack of water supply in disadvantaged communities and for communities relying on domestic wells. So I may have rambled a bit there, but I'll just say that who has decision-making authority is really critical here.
No, you were not rambling, and thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, so there's two good questions here. I'll ask one of them, and we'll see. Low-income communities such as Richmond and Kettleman City have high levels of particulate matter and VOC pollution, but there's a lack of action. How can we make change by using science and organizing in partnership together?
I can't speak to Richmond, but several years ago, I know that there are really great folks and really great community leaders in Kettleman City. led by the A La Torre family in Kettleman. So I know that there is really good generational community organizing coming out of Kettleman City, where community leaders have called for both the local and state action to address a number of issues. And so, I think it as you said very clearly early on, was this isn't just, science is not gonna, in the region, I'm trying to find a way of saying this, but we work and I live in a very politically conservative region. I mean, our Fresno County Board of Supervisors just rejected a grant to do vulnerability planning for disadvantaged communities because for not very great reasons. And I would say that it goes back to people power and really centering community voices, really getting at the root of the issue. So we can talk in adaptation and mitigation and resilience and use all these words, just transition. But at the end of the day, what does it mean for Maricela's family in Kettleman City? And how are those impacts manifesting themselves in their health, in their quality of life, in their life expectancy? And lead with that in a way where you are a resource and a tool, but not the driver of how action and advocacy takes shape.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, both of you. Let's give them a big hand for all that they do. Fantastic work. We now are going to take a break for networking until 10:55, and you can find our speakers and ask them more questions. Thank you, everybody, and let's give them a hand one more time. Thank you so much, Veronica and Dr. Cha.
What a remarkable morning we've had. I call it Act 1, and you will not be disappointed by Act 2. My name is Susan Longville, and I am a member of the Climate Center Board, and I have the distinct privilege of introducing Celeste Cantu because I've worked with her. And let me tell you a little bit about her. Celeste comes from a frontline community, the Imperial Valley, the city of Calexico. And a woman with these, impressive degrees from Yale and Harvard, who was a land use planner. So certainly it was a surprise to many of us when she was chosen to lead the State Water Resources Control Board. In California, that's the major leagues. That's the Supreme Court of Water, where we look at water rights and flows in rivers and how we comply with environmental regulations to solve complex problems. And when Celeste Cantu came, I was curious, why was she chosen? Well, over the next 5 years, we found that she had an interdisciplinary understanding of water policy that the state of California had actually never seen at that leadership level. I became a huge fan of not just her problem-solving skills and the way she approached things as she worked with this board, 5 members that are appointed by the governor, that are approved by the Senate. I mean, these are the people who manage our droughts. And Celeste performed brilliantly. 5 years later, in 2006, nothing could have made me happier than Celeste Cantu being chosen to be the general manager of the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority. We call it SAPA down in Southern California, but it is the watershed of the Santa Ana River. Now, the Santa Ana River is a mighty river. Before the Army Corps built 2 dams on it, they called it the mightiest uncontrolled river west of the Mississippi. We had enormous floods in wet years. Hundreds, if not thousands of people were swept down the rivers, destroyed multiple properties. I mean, we flooded Disneyland twice, but the river was dammed, but we had all these communities along the river. And what did we have? We had a reliable local source of water, and we fought over it. We litigated, and SAPA was born out of litigation. Celeste Cantu came down to SAPA, and she'd only been there 1 year. Can you put up that slide for me? Is it up? I can't see it. There it is. Celeste had only been at SAPA for 7 months when she defined the challenges we faced, and she said climate change. Now, back in those days, you could be banished, for saying climate change, because it in the world of water. But what did we know? Can you throw up the next slide? Just 4 years before that, the biggest, most destructive fire in California, was in the Santa Ana watershed. It started in 3 national forests. It burned more homes than we had ever seen. So the Santa Ana watershed understood it was a changing climate, that droughts were, caused huge fires, that they affected our water supplies, we depended on. So now, I'd like you all to give a warm welcome to Celeste. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. She has always inspired people, and she is a leader that's made a huge difference. Celeste Cantu.
I should just give up while I'm ahead. I don't know. Thank you. That was a very gracious introduction. Let me start with saying, I think this is the first time I've ever spoken before a group of exclusive climate change people. I know you're not really exclusive climate change people, because what we used to think of as climate change scientists and advocates has really grown to include a lot of people, because all of us have to be climate change advocates now. But the first thing I said when I was called by the Climate Center, I really thanked them for inviting me and Susan for inviting me, is I'm a water person. So I'm a very improbable speaker to a climate change, because unfortunately our silos have been separated. And they've been defined separately for lots of reasons, mainly because the water people embraced adaptation very early, and the climate people who were really advocating for mitigation saw that as a sellout. We embraced adaptation because people were going to die and dehydrate, and it was going to be really bad. So that's the reason we did it. The fact of the matter is today we have to do both, and we have to do them simultaneously. I became a water person. That was improbable too, because I absolutely rejected water when I was 8 years old. I grew up in Calexico, and the Colorado River is where we get our water there. My family's from Mexicali. They farmed and had business in Mexicali across the border. And I would fall asleep at night with my grandfather and my father and my great uncles and all the men yelling and screaming about salinity contents in Colorado River deliveries to Baja California. And I decided water was the venue for old men. I was completely right until like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 10 to be particularly generous. And I wanted to do urban planning, because in Calexico, my friends from kindergarten on were students, girls who were migratory. Their families they're farm workers. They would migrate with the crops. And so they started out like super smart, and the teachers loved them, and they were my best friends. And then they would leave for a great deal of the year and go to 2 other schools perhaps, or else even miss school, because they went with their families. There was no permanent farm worker housing. And they would come back, and every year they would fall further behind. And their interest in school waned, and the teachers even had less interest in them. And that was my first experience with issues of equity. And I decided I wanted to build affordable housing for farm workers. So I got a degree in urban planning. I came back to Calexico. I was the planning director. Later, I ran the county housing authority, and we built about $100 million worth of farm worker housing, and so people could have permanent affordable housing year round. But the whole time, I love that this is a participatory audience, but the whole time I was being pulled to water. Water was, I guess, in my blood, or at least Colorado River salt was in my blood, because I kept reinterpreting every issue, be it urban planning or be it housing, as an issue that came back to water and water availability. I grew up in Calexico on the outskirts outside the city limits, and we didn't have piped drinking water. We still don't have piped drinking water. It's just not available. It is not being provided by our water district, which is an irrigation water district. We were lucky in that we could pay for water deliveries. Not everybody who lives in the unincorporated areas in Imperial County can pay for water deliveries. And so they need to take 5-gallon jugs into the town, into their tia or a friend or somebody they know who fill it up, and then that's their drinking water. That's still the case. When I grew up and got married and bought a place, I lived out in the country and had the same situation that continues. So the issue of human right to water became very clear to me before that phrase was crafted. Anyway, all of these came together now. So here we are in 2022, and we realize that when we think about climate change, it's also about land use. It's also about equity. It's also about water. It's also about forest health and land health. So all those things finally are coming together. I think this is what happens when you're in your 60s. All of your efforts come together. But you seem like a really super knowledgeable group, so this next slide may not be that helpful to you, but I wanted to kind of warm you up with a water audience interaction opportunity. So slide, please. So this is an audience participation program. I'm going to ask you a question, and you have to shout out your answer. And you can't just stay quiet. We're all in now. Every single person has to be involved in all the work that we do, and including the following. How many gallons does it take to produce I should give you a little bit more background. So my work with water, I work with blue water, I work with gray water, black water, purple pipe water, but also green water. So you might not know what green water is. It is the water embedded in goods and services, fruits and vegetables, beef, all protein, everything. And so when you think about your water use or your water footprint, it's not just the water you turn out of your tap or out of your hose. It is the water you also consume and the food choices you make. So we have a test. We have a participatory program. So I'm clicking this one button I have. Go to the right. Oh, got it. Okay, apple. We got to do this really fast because we don't have any time. How many gallons of water does it take to produce an apple? 250. That was really ambitious. 19. It's probably more than I heard. A lot of 4s and 5s. Yeah, 19. How many does it take to produce a glass of wine? 32. You're doing pretty good. I think you're getting it. How many does it take to produce a cup of coffee? Now, this coffee, of course, is grown probably not in the United States or in California. Pretty good, 37. I knew you were a savvy group. Orange juice. Pretend it's California oranges, but this is probably Florida oranges, but pretend it's ours. 45. So somebody's a winner over here. All right, you guys are doing well. A single egg. 53. Because you have to wash the egg also. But protein takes a lot of water. Glass of milk. This is from California. 63. So you know the numbers are going up. I should really mix them up. Okay, cotton t-shirt. 500. That's what it takes. Okay, now you ready for the biggest, hamburger. It's everything in there. All of it. Gallons of water. Okay, now, car choices are important, and I think you guys probably are really good at this one. How many gallons does it take to make an SUV? 39,000. So let that sink in. So when we talk about climate change, we have to talk about water. And there's so many reasons why we have to do that. Number one, a lot of people are afraid about climate change. We talk about Celsius. We're Americans. They can't do Celsius, It's us and one other country in the world, I think, that are still locked onto this imperial system. So we just can't do Celsius. But one thing that they absolutely can relate to is water, because it's something they interact with every single day. And because we're in a horrible drought, and we will always be in a horrible drought. In fact, we can't even call it drought anymore, because a drought definition is an uncommon or unusual event that causes water shortage. Well, this is the normal. So it's, aridation. That's where we are now. We are in a increasingly arid thing, and it's not drought. It's what we need to live with. And we have all these models. We know it gets increasingly worse. In 2050, it goes off the cliff worse. So most of us are going to be able to make that, but we've got to do what we need to do to make this place inhabitable. Because as bad as it is in California in 2050, we're still way better off than a whole lot of other places. So we've got to make it work here. So how bad is it really? Well, it's horrible. The facts are really horrible. People, particularly people of color in our poorest communities, our critters and fish and nature bear the brunt of climate change. Water in California manifests climate change. Climate change is first felt in terms of water. This past year, in the past 2 years, we've made record events on all kinds of bad things. It's the worst ever, heat wave. It's the worst ever drought, the worst ever flood. We have this whiplash effect that is a result of climate change where you have dry, 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 and then you just get all the precipitation at once. Our precipitation patterns have totally changed. We used to, the whole state is engineered with Mother Nature. We have this deal where Mother Nature snows in the mountains, and then it melts just when we need it, and that we can naturally convey that hydrologically until we capture it, and then we use that water for our communities and for our farms. Well, that deal's off. So that's a huge problem. Much of that work is huge infrastructure, driven by large institutions. None of them can be nimble. It's impossible. So what we look to is the adaptation has to be done at the local level, and water is really decentralized. People think it's not. People think the water board, does everything, but in fact, we just bust some people when we can. But the fact is, water decisions are made at the local level. So institutionally, that puts us in a good place because people change their minds on a local level. They change their minds only when they feel there's trust in their community. And in the water community, there's very little trust. So we have a campaign about that, and we've made a lot of progress, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But if you want to know more of the bad news, I think you can just read about it in all the paper. I'm going to talk about one thing that maybe you aren't going to read in the paper, and that's about the amount of land, agricultural land that we lose. Now, a lot of people get mad at ag because they use a lot of water. Well, protein and the stuff that you eat takes a lot of water. They're generally incredibly efficient. Who's not efficient are people who grow grass. Grass is the largest cultivated, irrigated, and fertilized crop in the nation, and it feeds no one. In fact, it starves the birds and the bees because it doesn't, flower or seed, because you mow it all the time. So grass is really our biggest enemy, not ag. Now, will ag take a hit? Ag is taking a huge hit, all the way from the Klamath all the way down. Imperial Valley is not yet taking a hit. Colorado River is also in an enduring drought. The day of reckoning is just coming. It'll be here. They are scrambling to develop compacts and, soft landings and all kinds of things to try to spread that water and manage that water so that the hardship would be minimized. But there will be hardship, and there is hardship, and we will lose acres. My fear is, from a land use perspective, when you think of a healthy operating ecosystem, when you lose land from ag, it generally becomes suburbanized, which means degraded. So the task is, we will be retiring lots of ag because we don't have the water, and we've got to move that land into parks and natural resources and habitat and things people can use and critters can use. And I am hopeful we could come out of this crisis better than we went into it in terms of people's ability to have a healthy life. We've got to make those right decisions. All of us look to Sacramento and Washington, D.C., and we lament, although we have great leadership in Sacramento, I have to say. None of it's fast enough, though, and they recognize that. The governor has announced a new partnership with the Water Foundation and other foundations that will be brought in to do the state's work. They realize they cannot do it. Okay, I'm almost done. They can't do it. And so they are moving together through the private sector, through the nonprofit sector to get that work done.
This is a great story. This is the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe up in Humboldt County. They have a very vulnerable grid. Their power goes off in a normal year 4 or 5 times a year. Often if there's a fire, it'll burn up, the transmission will be out of whack. They have a first aid clinic that they need to keep power on. We put this solar battery microgrid in there, and not long after the system was completed, there was a fire. It did knock out the transmission, and they didn't even notice. They kept the lights on. So really exciting part of the story. And this tribe has teamed up with about a dozen other tribes in that region to do something I think is really pathbreaking and inspiring, which is they have a vision to make that part of the state the first carbon negative region in the world. And that's a combination of offshore wind and transportation, electrification and efficiency and storage and renewables and carbon smart land management. But this is being led by the tribes, and they've been amazing on this. And I'll just share, I was just there about a week or two ago, and just to tell you this, there's a neighboring tribe, the Yurok, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. They view themselves, their purpose in this world as they call world renewal, and it's almost like a political campaign to save the earth. There's an intensity with the things that they're doing. They're doing the largest dam removal project in the world on the Klamath to restore the salmon run. And then I had the opportunity to see the condor. So condor went extinct over a century ago from lead bullets in that region, and they've just brought back for the first time 5 condor who are being released actually this week into the wild, and just an incredible, inspiring bit of leadership there. These birds, they live to 80 years old, 9.5-foot wingspans, and I know that when they take flight, they will take all of our hopes and dreams with them. It was super inspiring to see that. So energy efficiency and building decarb, this is also a really fundamental part of our strategy. You guys have all seen this chart before, but if you go back to the kind of the birth of the Energy Commission nearly 50 years ago, actually our energy use per capita pretty much matched the federal national energy use per capita. And then we came out with these codes, the first energy efficiency codes for new buildings, for new construction, and now we're using about 1/3 less energy than the rest of the country per capita, and that's a real tribute to California's leadership. And because we're such a big state, when we set a new standard for televisions, for refrigerators, for computers, our market with 40 million people, those industries can't sell into our market without complying with our standards. The manufacturers don't just want to upgrade the one line to serve the California market, want to serve everybody else. They often end up upgrading their line to serve the whole country or the whole world. So we have a much bigger footprint positively than just the savings from within our state. So making everything that connects to the grid a good citizen of the grid, this is really our mantra. It's really every single thing that touches the grid, from an electric vehicle to electric heat pump, water heater, and all the rest. We want to be responsive to the grid. That actually is not just good for the customer, it's good for the grid, and it means that we save a lot of money, because otherwise, if you have a more rigid system, you need to spend a lot more on generation capacity. And if you're smart with your usage, you can really avoid a lot more expense. So this is a big focus for us. I mentioned EV charging earlier. We're putting $3 billion into that, the Energy Commission alone, and we're going to be really focused on smart charging protocols. So let me just close with this thought. I think this budget that we're doing this year should be understood, which includes, as I mentioned, $10 billion for transportation electrification, along with $1 billion for building decarbonization electrification. That itself should be really understood like any one of these other landmark bills that we've talked about, AB 32 or SB 100. It's transformative. And so what happens in California when we get this stuff over the finish line and get it implemented, it really does get adopted by other states and by Congress and the White House. And so, we should all take pride in that. This is, I think, a time for us to think big and aim high. 2022 is actually the year of the tiger. And my family's Chinese. I was asking my wife's parents to say a little bit about what that means. And it means time to sort of be bold and be brave and to purge evils. And I said, well, that sounds great. Let's do it. So the Year of the Tiger, I really feel we should all take that to heart, and we can chalk up some big wins for our state and our nation and our world together. Thank you so much.
All right, very exciting. Once again, we apologize for not being able to have questions during this portion. However, for the next section, we will have Q&A period. So please keep questions coming, and thank you all for your engagement in all these fantastic speakers that we have here today. Moving us right along, I'd like to invite Colby Burmell to the stage. He's going to introduce our esteemed panel of legislators and activists. As you can see, we're moving from problem to solution. So here we go. Let's hear some more solutions. Colby, why don't you come on up?
Thank you so much for that intro, Ron, and thank you, Chair Hochschild, for your address just now. And thank you all for being here at today's conference. We're going to be talking with some state lawmakers and some advocates today about the topic of, quote, restoring California's climate leadership. So my name is Colby Burmell, and I'm the energy and environment reporter for Politico, California, based in Sacramento. And just a quick journalistic plug for myself, if I may, is to please reach out anytime with tips or complaints. I take both, because I always love hearing from everyone. I will keep my intro short just so we can get straight to our speakers. We have Assemblymember Cristina Garcia from Bell Gardens. We have, We also have Senator Bob Wieckowski from Fremont, who's the chair of the Budget Subcommittee. And we also have Allie Detrio, who is the chief strategist at Reimagine Power and the senior advisor to the Microgrid Resources Coalition. So we'd love to bring the speakers up now. So we're going to have those, I think, speakers come join me on stage, right? Yep. Thank you. Not too scary up here, I don't think.
Okay.
Well, thank you to our three speakers for being here today. And just to give the audience out here a quick sense of the structure today, I'm first going to ask each of our panelists like an individual question that's tailored to their work. And then I'm going to put a question or two to all of them. And then we're going to also have audience Q&A as well. So please look at the cards that are on your tables. Be sure to write down any questions, and please either just run them up here, or we will be having people going around, because we would love to hear your questions for our state lawmakers and advocates today. So let's get right to it. I'd love to start with Assemblymember Garcia. I wanted to ask you about AB 2649, which is your bill that's called the Natural Carbon Sequestration and Resilience Act. And I would love to hear you tell us what the bill would do, but also maybe why you chose the natural and working land route compared to technological solutions like direct air capture, which I know the EJ community is, kind of opposed to.
Thank you. It has my name on it, but it's actually the coalition's bill, and so it's been exciting to work with everyone on this bill. Just a little bit about my district, and that paints a lot of the work that I do, and we all sit on experience. My district is landlocked with 6 freeways. We are tree canopy poor. We are open space poor. It's one of the most polluted areas in Southern California and the state out there. And growing up, my sister and I used to joke that we'd be geniuses if we didn't have all the chemicals in our body. In part because we would see these smokestacks and we're like, well, what is that? What's happening to us? But we had no answers. But fast forward to 30 years later, and we have a lot of answers. There's a lot of data, and we're able to see that picture. And that joke isn't so much of a joke from my community, actually. And we see how all of those toxics are affecting young children's ability to develop and think and be the leaders that we need them to be. And so as we've been talking about carbon capture, and we've been chasing these technological advances, and I put that in quotation marks, I'm not sure if they're advancements or not, to what point Councilor Rivas before in this space out there, and other leaders as well, but decided to jump in there in a slightly different role this time around. And the bill, if you ask me, is modest. Earlier in the year, the Speaker said that California is falling behind, and you know, we're not as bold as I have seen us be, but the bill is modest. It only asks for 60 million metric tons by 2030 to be captured in our natural working lands, increasing it to 75 million by 2035. And I say that it's modest because we know we could capture at least 100 million metric tons in our working lands, in our natural lands out there. And so it's a modest bill if you ask me, and it's just saying, let's use science to guide decisions in an economical way.
Thank you so much for that, Assemblymember, and we're going to get to talking about Speaker Redden's comments, of course, in a bit. I wanted to ask Allie about the bill that the organization that he's representing, like the Microgrid Resources Coalition, is sponsoring, which is SB 833. And that's a bill by Senator Dodd that would require the CEC to start a grant program for local governments to help with community energy resilience plans. And I wanted to ask Allie, what makes this bill unique kind of compared to existing state energy policy? And I wanted to ask about the current bill's prospects, given that SB 99 last year, was held in appropriations.
Yeah, thanks, Colby. The Climate Center is sponsoring SB 833, and the Microgrid Resources Coalition is also working closely with them to pass this bill. Essentially, it would create a grant program for local governments to develop community energy resilience plans. And some of the work that the Climate Center did over the last couple of years as we ran this bill was really trying to understand the needs and the challenges of local governments as we look at, how we upgrade our energy infrastructure, grid modernization, deploying local clean energy resources. And overwhelmingly, one of the main takeaways was that local governments don't have the capacity, the staff resources, and the financial resources to really plan comprehensively for community energy resilience. And so this grant program that we're trying to create here is really meant to provide that capacity, provide those resources that local governments need in order to develop these plans and actually help successfully plan and implement clean energy projects in their communities that are both resilient, sustainable, and are looking holistically at the needs of the communities. So incorporating things like equity and environmental justice considerations into that, it's really important. Now, there's a long history with the bill, as Colby mentioned. We did try to run it multiple years now, and last year it was SB 99. And with the pandemic of 2020, it was really just very challenging to run a bill in 2020. So we introduced it in 2021 as SB 99, and it unfortunately got held in appropriations. And so this year we're coming back again with the bill and really looking this time to also have a complementary funding source to go along with it so that hopefully we can get it out of appropriations this year and over the finish line. And so right now we are looking at, doing a community energy resilience package with SB 833 and then a complementary budget request as well. And so we really are hopeful that it will be successful this year and that these ideas have been percolating for a while in the legislature, and so we can get it done this year.
Yeah, thanks for the backstory. And of course, speaking of the energy budget, we have Senator Wieckowski here, of course. For those of you who don't know, he's the chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee number 2 on resources, environmental protection, and energy. It's a mouthful. Basically, he's in charge of all the climate money from the Senate side. And so I wanted to ask you more of a general question, which is just talking about Governor Newsom's budget proposal from January and with regards to climate, and just asking kind of what you make of it, and also what is missing from it potentially.
Well, thank you. There's a lot to like about the governor's climate. Heard Chair Hochschild talk about the $10 billion in clean energy. The Senate has been, putting money into natural working lands for about 5 years. Sometimes it doesn't make it across the finish line, and also that we fund different projects. So there's, in the big picture, there's a lot to look at. It falls short on meeting some of the goals. I mean, I think last year we called for $5 billion in fire prevention. Right now we spend 2.2 in suppression, and everybody in junior high knows that we're doing too much suppression and not enough prevention. And there's a meager amount in prevention, so that's bad. In drought, we've got to double down on the drought so that we don't go from one emergency to the other, that we put more real money, now that we have money, into water recycling, flood control. I was at, in South San Francisco, they have a real great collaborative effort with the federal government, the Army Corps, local governments on wetland restoration. And back in the day, it was nice to talk about wetland restoration, like the little critters are there and the pickleweed grows and it's cute and we're all environmentalists and yada yada. But now we talk about the flood management, how that protects those high-tech buildings in San Jose, how it impacts low-income areas that are prone to flooding, like in Hayward and Alviso, because you restore the wetlands, and how it acts like a big sink to suck up the carbon. We have to do more money on, or put some more money on the biodiversity that he has, and that 30 by 30, and then last on sea level rise. I think there's, last year we tried to put together a package, the climate package that we did, notwithstanding remarks that California is not leading. We were spending a lot of money on programs and not having new bills. So we'll start our debates, and I have hearings next week on what additionality that we want in the Senate program. And as my friends know, we'll tend to be aggressive on what we want to do.
Yeah, and we'll be watching those, of course. And I wanted to put that budget question also to the Assembly member and to Allie as well. Just what y'all make of the proposed climate budget and what you think needs to be in there or improved.
I want to say that Mr. Wieckowski has always been bold and has been a leader, but you don't always convince our peers to listen to us. I have some problems in my house too. I think for myself, one of the biggest issues is I don't just want to be throwing money at things without making sure that we have a clear plan and accountability, and it's going and leading with the lens on equity out there. And so when we talk about sea level rise, it's important, and I live not too far from the ocean, but it's not my community at all. But when I see the small amount that we've been doing for extreme heat for communities like mine, it's been things like cooling centers. It's like, that's not good enough for me. And so don't do the lowest hanging fruit because you have to do something for me, but actually do something for my community tonight that's going to help us be healthier long haul. And I do agree, I am really concerned about our investment around the drought and water, and for me it's groundwater specifically, and I have a lot of contamination, and so we don't clean that up, I can't get to that groundwater, and my alternative is importing a bunch of water that's not sustainable but also not affordable out there. And so I agree with Mr. Wieckowski that we need to be doing more in that space, but for me specifically cleaning up toxics, whether it's toxics that we have a lot of information about, or newer things like PFAS that we're learning more and more about, and something that's poisoning my community on a regular basis as well. And I'm not the only community out there, but more details that we're a little more intentional around these issues is important for me. I will say the other thing that I'm constantly looking at is the co-benefits that we could have out there. And so we talk a lot about carbon, and that discussion has always come with this idea of clean air. We know that's not necessarily true, and so for me it's how do I also get that cleaner air, and do I need to have things that are parallel and just as important? And I've been told numerous times in the Capitol that that's not that important, that doesn't matter. But when you're talking about frontline communities, it can't just be about carbon capture, it's that and removing the toxics out there as well. And so the proposal is great. I think it's amazing. We are trying to be bold. I've talked to the administration. I know equity's in their mind. We've been talking about how do we actually make that a reality out there. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. So I'm excited to see the hearings as they move on and the different leadership to piece something together between now and the end of the session.
Thank you for that. And wanted to make sure Allie wanted to speak on anything potentially in the budget.
I think there's a lot to like in the governor's budget, especially when we look at equitable building decarbonization and looking at, other cleaner alternative fuels like hydrogen, bioenergy. I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. I do think that we could have a more dedicated, line item for community energy resilience, as I mentioned before, but specifically on distributed energy resources and community level solutions. And so looking through and how are we going to fill in the gaps of all the things that are really great about that budget. I do think things like microgrids, solar and storage, bioenergy resources for the rural communities, doing things like community resilience centers. I think all of those things are really important, and I think that's what we really could do to fill one of the gaps in the budget is look at more community-based solutions, and local government distributed energy resources I think are a key thing that the government can really help do this year in the budget.
Thank Thank you. And wanted to send out like a reminder to please submit your questions. We're about to get to that in a little bit, so would love to hear from y'all. Wanted to ask about a few kind of hot topics like in the energy world. You know, one of them being rooftop solar, of course, you know, at the net metering proceeding at the CPUC. You know, Assemblymember Garcia, I know that you sent a letter opposing the proposed decision that came out like in December that would cut bill credits and would impose a monthly grid charge. Allie, you know, one of your clients, Ivy Energy, is trying to support like virtual net metering, of course. But I wanted to start like with Senator, you know, Wieckowski, because I don't think that you've taken like a public position necessarily on what the CPUC has done, but wanted to get your thoughts first, and then we can bring in the others.
Right. Normally, when I have jurisdiction over the Energy Commission or CPUC, I don't write letters with other members. Just sort of my policy is that I had them to the committee. We're asking as it was going on. I have plenty of friends who harass me over why I wasn't doing it, but that's just sort of, they're just the way I conduct myself. I'm aggressive enough when I have the oversight with them. With that said, they back down. You know, they're going to consider it. There's so many other things that we are doing simultaneously that sometimes I think we get focused on one little element because it's in the San Francisco Chronicle or the Sacramento Bee, and this becomes the hot tomato. And sort of my job is to look at all these budget considerations are going forward and figure out what helps to get the biggest bang for the buck.
Thank you. And wanted to give the Assembly member like an Allie a chance to speak on net metering if they want to.
I'll just say, I really believe that tariffs and special rates for, you know, helping to meet policy goals like get 1 million solar roofs that, you know, Chair Hochschild, Walker, so many other people have been a part of, and really revolutionizing the solar industry, not just for California, but for the world. And there's a lot of benefits, I think, that are not being shown in the calculations. But ultimately, I believe that rates and tariffs are helping with cost sharing. They're not cost shifting. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember, one, first and foremost. Two, can we do more? Absolutely. The multifamily sector, which I'm representing in the net metering proceeding right now, you know, there has not been enough solar deployed in multifamily buildings. And so I think that between the legislature and the CPUC, more can be done to help improve equity outcomes in the net metering proceeding and with rooftop solar in general. But I do think it's really important to remember that we have a bigger picture, as Senator Wieckowski said, with meeting our climate goals, empowering customers to be part of the clean energy transition, and modernizing our grid is going to take everyone. It can't just be 3 large utilities running the state and doing all of that work. We really need customers in the private sector to step up, and so I think the net metering tariffs and rates and tariffs in general really help with the cost sharing aspect of that, and so remembering the bigger picture is really important.
So I live in the city of Bill Gardens. It's a working class community, and up until last year there was no residential solar in that city. We finally got the first panels on a house 3 doors from my house, so it's exciting to see there. So we've become the poster child of equity and being left behind, and it's become an opportunity for, I used to say we care about you, and I'm not totally sure that that's all true. Most of the time they're caring about themselves and their bottom lines. I see the same type of narrative with the fossil fuels when they're saying we can't do this, it's too expensive, it's going to be really burdensome for communities like mine. And again, I'm not really clear that they care about us, but more their bottom lines out there. And so I acknowledge that the system hasn't worked for communities like mine. Bill Gardens is also 80% renters out there. And so as we talk about multifamily sector, how do we do that better? It's an example of the barriers we have that we need to address. And so when I saw this proposal, I agree that we haven't done it great in communities like mine, and we need to figure it out so that we're not just cost shifting. But I do think just walking away from completely walks away from our climate change goals. And at the end of the day, the communities that bear the biggest burden are those same communities who are pretending to help by delaying our goals in climate change. And so we can't walk away. We can't walk, because we haven't figured it out, doesn't mean we walk away from figuring out how do we get those rooftop solars in communities like mine. And so I still want to see more of that one household that has it. I still want to figure out how we have those conversations better with landlords out there to to put this on their rooftops out there so that their tenants can benefit from this. And you can't just say, oh, out of their greatness of their heart, they're business people at the end of the day, so it doesn't work that way either. And so I do think we need to do more. We need to do more to also ensure that our nonprofits and our churches and our schools that are such an important part of our community are part of this discussion, the education, but also part of enjoying microgrids and other things that we could see that we could be proud of to showcase in our community with our neighbors out there. So I did oppose what was happening at the PUC, not because everything that we've been doing works, but just walking away from completely from what we're doing doesn't make sense to me.
Well, thank you all for that perspective. And another hot topic that we had a lot of discussion on this morning was about cap and trade, of course. And some of y'all might have seen the oversight hearing that Senator Wieckowski held back in February, about the independent, market report about the hoarding of credits, essentially. And so I wanted to start with you first, just to kind of start, what, if any, kind of reforms should occur with cap and trade, and whether there's even the political will to do so, given back in 2017, the whole fight there.
Well, the timing may be right to have the discussion. We've got this GAN limit problem, which, because the revenues have come up, that we either have to rebate it back, which is not one of my ideas, or invest in infrastructure. And one of the things we see, the cap and trade, because it's an auction, doesn't count as additional revenues. And just so everybody knows, after the May auction will be out, $4.4 billion is what we're going to have in cap and trade revenues. But we can pull out the investments that we have for infrastructure and pay those with general funds. So that opens up the door to have the discussions. High-speed rail is going to be $1 billion, and you can build that up with other climate planning programs or things that are soft costs, I guess you'd put it in. I've been a big mouth about allowances and about how many, the independent report came in, and, I was rather shocked at the dismissiveness of the Air Board about, we'll just agree to disagree. And I said, well, these are facts. It's not like, the Easter Bunny that we're talking about that we may disagree whether it's real or not real. So, and then offsets. Offsets is sort of the groovy thing. I was in Glasgow, and everybody loves to talk about offsets. We're going to, save a forest here, and the Native Americans. I used to go there as a kid. They really like offsets because it's a way for them to get some money. But at the hearing, we asked the chairman of the board of the Air Board, this forest burnt down, and you still gave them credit for the offset because there was a contract. And I'm a lawyer. The lawyers could say that, but that's just not right to be doing. So. We'll continue to push them. I don't know if we can do things, tweak with it legislatively, or put some pressure on them as we go through the scoping plan now. And, we did it in 2017. It was aggravating because, the idea was to, when we extended cap and trade, to put in a provision to not allow any of the allowances, because all the allowances is just free money. It's like monopoly. So I'm hopeful. Let me just say I'm hopeful as we put some pressure on them. And remember, there's a new chair and new board members, so is an opportunity for them to say, okay, we're going to run the show the way that we like to run it. And I love Mary Nichols, so I'm just saying that.
Like Assemblymember Garcia, I wanted to see if you wanted to maybe speak on the EJ considerations tied to cap and trade, given that that's part of your district essentially.
Yeah. Before I do that. I hope that as we're pushing on the scoping plan, we ask ourselves the question of, is cap and trade supposed to be generating revenue to pay for our pet projects? And in full disclosure, cap and trade is paying for some of my cleaner stuff in my community too. And that's a discussion that, we go back and forth with the EJ community if that's the best way to do it or not. Or is it supposed to be reducing emissions? And if it's the latter, which I do believe it should be, that's a promise we made, we're failing at that. And so as we're doing the scope and plan, we need to be asking those questions and then making decisions to honor that promise. And so I think the discussion around allowances, around a floor, about whether or not you hoard these allowances, which I agree with Mr. Wieckowski. I'm on your team on that. We need to rethink. But I also hope that as we're doing scoping plan, that we are talking about putting metrics that speaks to the communities out there. And so at the end of the day, are we healthier? Last year, I was working on a bill to add a health metric to the scoping plan, and it died in the Senate Appropriations. Ironically, somewhere at the beginning of the year, I got a call from someone in administration saying, you know what we should do? There should be a health metric in here. And I was like, that's so funny. You guys told me no last year. But I do hope that that's something that we figure out along the way. The reality is that we have a lot of schemes out there, whether it's cap and trade or through our waste management, where we're pretending to be doing stuff that helps some communities and leaves other communities behind, and we continue to pollute other communities who are bearing the burden out there. And so when we're picking winners or losers, or only some communities are getting community action plans to reduce emissions, that's not real equity at the end of the day. That's not real environmental justice. When I know I have hundreds of vulnerable communities out there and we're not giving them the skills, the tools, and the resources to help themselves, we have a system that's broken. And so I think a lot of the criticisms from my EJ groups are fair. I don't disagree with them. I keep telling them that they're the North Star to remind me of the work we still have to do. But I'm also just one of 121 people that get to make decisions, the 120 legislators and the governor. And so I need a compromise. When we're doing cap and trade, Jerry Brown had gotten everything he wanted until then. And we tried to have a bill that was more centered around environmental justice communities and ensuring that you could only be part of cap and trade if you actually were reducing emissions in those communities. And that bill couldn't get 41 votes, much less 2/3, which is what the governor wanted. And we got pushed out of the discussion really quickly. And it was like, okay, he's gonna get what he wants. How do we get something out of this? And I'm not gonna make my EJ community happy, but I need to move the ball forward because the exchange is nothing, which has been my whole life out there.
Well, thank you both for those nuanced perspectives. Wanted to ask a general question first before we get to the audience questions. Thank you so much for submitting those. I wanted to ask, of course, about Speaker Rendon's comments last fall at COP when he said that California is not leading anymore on climate. So I wanted to ask y'all if you had a wish list or a magic wand, essentially, what should the state be doing that it's not already doing on climate that would help restore the state's leadership? And whoever wants to take it now. Big question.
Well, I'm one for controversy. I don't know if we need to set new targets. Everybody, we're legislators, or we two of us are, we get in and we set targets rather than just achieving the targets. In 2018, 2019, we reduced greenhouse emissions by 1.6%. And that was the second best that we've done. And all the scientists and everybody says that we have to be reducing it by 4.3 in order to get to the 2030 goal. So when it was 20% by 1990, you can click around at 1.9, 1.7. The UN just came out with a report that's saying worldwide we have to get to 7.3. So it's like I'm on a diet. I could say, well, now I want to lose 40 pounds. I want to lose 60 pounds, or whatever the number is. Just lose the weight, dude. So we could serve as a model to the world if we got on that diet and said, okay, California has reduced their emissions by 7.6%. That's what the whole world should be doing. Follow the leader.
So selfishly, I'm going to say that I'm okay with setting a goal like AB 2649 is setting for us of using our working lands, natural lands, to capture a lot of this carbon that's already out there, and then putting the resources and the regulation to actually get to that goal and lose the weight like you said out there. And so I do think we run the risk if all we do is have goals with incentives without any sticks. We're going to miss the mark yet again. And so we need to have that political will. It's easy for us to say that. This is our last year here.
Right.
So we have lots of political will.
No, and so she knows that for 5 years ago, my Senate subcommittee put $100 million into natural working lands in the budget. And every year it gets taken out or it gets diminished to nothing. And now it's the governor's idea. So it's a great idea.
Yeah. But we need more that. We need more than that, actually. And we need to put a little bit less on the technological side of things out there. And so we keep talking about carbon capture and these stacks out there that the fossil fuel industry is pushing, not to reduce emissions, but to continue with the status quo out there. And so we need to call that what it is. and we need to say no. We had a bill on that didn't get off the Senate floor. We didn't get anywhere close near the votes that we needed out there. And again, it was another modest bill that limited to what the science says, which is, the last 10% if we really need, but try everything else first. And so that's an example of us falling behind. We have some pragmatic policies out there that can get us to be successful with that diet, and we haven't been able to find the political will to get it done. I hope that we do this year, because every day we're waking up to the record-breaking fire or drought, or we're hearing about the flood someplace else. And so, Mother Nature is telling us every day that our time is now to take action.
We have several audience questions about SB 833, so I wanted to direct those to Allie, of course. This question here says that local governments are not trusted by many frontline communities. How to guarantee that the results will be equitable and advance justice, as talked about by earlier speakers. And there's similar questions about how are local governments supposed to pay for climate work, and also how the community can also access information tied to all this.
Great questions. I'll just say, one, there is no guarantee, right? I think we have to do the best that we can. And from a state level perspective, when you're looking at allocating resources, setting goals, directing budgets, the natural flow down is to, regulatory agencies, local governments, and others. I do think that it's a really important role of the local government to bring in different community groups and constituencies to make sure that equity and environmental justice are incorporated from the beginning. And I think looking at this from a bottom-up approach and really incorporating the community-based solutions we need is going to be critical. So, but there is no guarantee. I think we have got to do the best we can, and I understand that there's mistrust of local governments or government figures in general. And so I do think that with these types of planning that we can do, a lot more of this planning and implementation dollars should also go to nonprofits and community-based organizations so that they can also play a very meaningful role in the development of planning and implementation for community energy resilience.
So a funny thing happened when we were in Paris and at the ICOP. I did, De Leon had SB 100, Lara had 1383 on organics and black carbon. I did a climate adaptation bill. And it was at the time the Paris Accord said they wanted to spend $17 million on climate adaptation. What we did in the Office of Planning and Research set up this ICARP, the Independent Climate Action, blah, 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 whatever it is. And what they did is they took information and shared it with local governments and put together regional groups, these regional groups that would, instead of just looking at Bell Gardens, they'd look at the basin that was there, all the neighbors, which local governments are not very good at doing. But they've been funding that planning process. And organically what happened is these collaboratives, these regional groups came together and said, well, we're in the watershed. I live in this city. Well, no, you're in this watershed. And how is the flooding going to affect you? So more of that is going on. There are some areas that haven't done the planning, and this last year's budget put a bunch of dough in to help them plan. But the bigger, exciting part is that the projects that they've come together is to have them actually fund them so that we can look at some of these climate solutions that they have. Most of them are natural solutions, but they've used that planning process to work together. The state has done it, and we just didn't know that they were doing it, but now, and we provide them one of the big elements is with the technical assistance. So some of the cities that are just too small to have a climate person or something like that will be able to take advantage of that. And obviously now that the program's up and running and it's popular, I want to be popular, so we'll fund it.
And so I think that that's a pretty piece of the puzzle, but I want to go back. I have 9 cities who are not doing anything, and it should be troubling for all of us. And they're in the shadows of the city of LA and the city of Long Beach, and often get told that they are the sacrifice ones for everyone else's progress. And so when the EJ groups are asking for certain things, we get told that's too expensive, that's not possible. And it's like, you just mean that we're not worth the investment. And so I do think that we need to be doing more to fund CBOs on the ground that become the balance for when local governments aren't taking action and become the energy to make sure local governments are partaking in opportunities like you've created for us out there. So the opportunity is great, but funding those CBOs on the ground is really important to do the work that the local government might not be doing, and then to push the local government to do that. And so that would be the only other piece out there that I would say for a community like mine.
We've gotten probably like a dozen, like or 2 dozen, like just amazing questions up here, but we are kind of running out of time. But I do want to ask one more question, and I wouldn't be a journalist necessarily for asking about something that's somewhat breaking, I guess, maybe is, there's the bill which comes from the question here, which is SB 1173, which would require CalPERS and CalSTRS to divest from fossil fuels. That's being heard tomorrow in committee before it goes to approps. And I just wanted to, I guess because it's on the Senate side, I wanted to ask Senator Wieckowski what his my position is on it. And I've actually been told that there's some climate activists outside of his office, so that's why I wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to.
My position is I'm abstaining tomorrow on the bill. I have, as I indicated with the PUC, we have constitutionally, we let the UC make the decisions and our retirement board to make the decisions, and just like we let judges make the decisions. And I may not like the ultimate decision that they do, but my study of the law separates those things and allow those folks to do it. I'm mindful that it's a hot topic. I read the staff report. I look and I'm a student of reading it. I'm going to talk to the author about 3 hours ago and promised that I would reread it to see if I missed some things. But that's where I sit today.
Great. Well, perfect.
Disappointingly so, I guess, of the crowd.
Well, that's a good answer. Thank you for sharing that with us. And, we got plenty of questions, about equity, about community energy, about cost shifts, about just all these different topics that we clearly need a lot more time to discuss. And maybe something, a kind of a fun wildcard question here too, maybe as well, is to maybe ask what some of the hurdles are to DERs like microgrids, whether that's, agencies, whether that's utilities, whether that's other players. Would be curious as to what's kind of broadly stopping us from moving towards a more decentralized DER-based future.
When it comes to distributed energy resources and microgrids in particular, I do think we have incumbents that, want to keep and preserve their market share, and so they're naturally resistive to new technologies, new solutions, new market participants. But I think ultimately the way we get to a more decentralized, decarbonized, resilient, sustainable, and equitable future is by empowering a diverse portfolio of resources and market participants. And so that's a big systemic barrier that I think that, the state will have to figure out. Also, we'll talk about this more in our Grid for the Future panel later this afternoon, but I think we need to stop having this either or conversation. It's a both and. We need centralized and decentralized solutions. So the quicker we can all agree that we need a diverse portfolio that includes both large and small, and sometimes for different reasons like resiliency and redundancy, and it's not just solar, it's not just electrification. We need bioenergy resources, we need other clean fuels as well. I think the faster we'll be able to meet all of our decarbonization goals. So let's try to, grow the pie for everyone.
No. I know that there's a problem with permitting that we have that people complain about, but I agree with you. I think it's the all hands on deck. We have so many energy needs that a little redundancy in the system would be okay. And then one of the things I'd like to see is us work better with our neighbors. New Mexico and Wyoming and Montana have really good wind sources, and they're a couple hours or a couple hundred miles east of us. And instead of just saying we're going to do it on our own and look to our neighbors to share the resources that we have for the greater good.
Senator Garcia, anything? Yeah.
I agree with all of that. I'm just going to say, as we're looking at this, we And so this is my plug. I didn't talk about this earlier. We do a lot of subsidies to help low-income communities be part of the discussion. But we seem to have a hard time actually doing the subsidies at the level that the community could afford. And so it's almost, or maybe giving it away. And for some reason, we have a hard time giving it away to them, but not to our big corporations with all of the tax credits we give away to them or all the other billions of dollars they get. And I always use the example of programs like Replace Your Ride, and you could get close to $10,000 to replace your ride, which is a lot of money. But if I'm trying to get a new electric car and I still have a $15,000, $20,000 car payment, that's still not affordable for my community. And so if you want to see those cars in my community, you have to give it away, and you have to be okay with that, because it's not good enough just to have charging stations around Bell Gardens, and all I have are the people on the 7 Trend who are traveling west and north, stopping to charge on their way out of the community. And so that's what's happening right now. And so for whatever reason, when I say I want to be like Oprah and be like, you get a car and you get a car, people laugh at me, but I really do think we need to be thinking that way, whether it's with cars or with microgrids and so forth, because we're going to have the same problem otherwise. We will then continue to have the trickle-down environmentalism that we gave then the talking point to the industry, to the fossil fuel, to the IOUs, to use that against us, pretending that they want to help communities like mine, but we just become a talking point to help their bottom lines.
Well, thank you all so much for a very lively and informative discussion today. Thank you all for your questions as well. And I'd like to pass it to Ron. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you.
I think